let me jump back into it. On the topic of Jordan Hall, I made a recording putting some suggestions to him, and I've just watched some content from him that was recently made, and I haven't revisited my old recording, but I imagine that a lot of what I say might in certain detail be more almost philosophically traced better in that original thing, because I made a lot of videos. I don't know if I uploaded them all, but or a lot of recordings that centered around a critique of his analysis on a psychological level almost. And so yeah, this might be a bit repetitive, but I do think it's worth putting these suggestions. I think I made the same kind of what's the word? No, I can't think of what the word is. That it means. I made a similar concession before, and I'll make it again. That I do think that there is contribution in what Jordan Hall is putting forward, but that contribution has to sort of be taken with a large grain of salt, as it were. It has to, you can use it as an ingredient, but it's not a properly tempered perspective. And I'm going to detail some of the defects in it again. So I think already you're going to run into problems when you use evolution as an analogy, because essentially you are employing a metaphysical model that is disembodied and abstract, which is characteristic. A lot of my critique is almost a characterological character. I've said before that it's unsettling, and I dislike it about myself that a lot of my analysis essentially reduces down to character assassination, because that is my field of speciality, at least in terms of psychological makeup. But and although I have not introduced those topics because they are such voluminous topics into theory of mind and such, but I'll just putting that aside, the kind of rationalization that Jordan Hall is what's the word? Is enamored with, or is utilizing, it has huge blind spots. And so in some level you can almost take what he says as a kind of check sheet as to what needs to be resolved when you are actually constructing some kind of alternative or some kind of solution. But his contribution is not going to be the direct cheese in the maze that guides you through. It's going to be a kind of afterthought, because the perspective is so so the sorts of terms that he puts emphasis on, in terms of that we have a problem. He slightly, he says some things, the fragments of which I find, perhaps not offensive, and they are perhaps, the fragments of his thinking are useful, but they have to be vastly recontextualized to get rid of the disembodied kind of solution that he has. And when you pose people, or when he is saddling himself with these abstract problems that plague the collective or that plague society, and taking responsibility for that kind of societal guilt, as it were, and having to kind of combat that and work out something that obviates that. I'll note that his very solutions that he gives, his 4-stage solution, it just kind of presupposes that there will be an edifice that will support that kind of individualistic operation, that you can just be completely focused on getting your own house in order, and that there will be nothing. And this, I think, is a huge oversight. That the problem that he has is that he talks about it slightly, and I understand that this thing that I watched is let's say a condensed version of his work. So, I would love for someone to underline the very specific details that perhaps he has not provided in this, but I think it is clear from what he put forward that he has made these oversights, that the structural problems and the institutional problems, he just kind of obviates, and he thinks that enlightened individualism is going to just somewhat is going to make them disappear. That, I think, is inherently problematic. Even if I understand his problem of dominance hierarchy, and the idea that you're going to kind of that every individual in your society is going to opt out of the dominance hierarchy game, or game A, that is not feasible. The idea that he's just going to get every individual to opt out of it, and not even through the vehicle of some kind of religion, or some kind of group enterprise, or some kind of consensus building machinery. He doesn't put any thought towards that. It's just this kind of pure intellectual thing that everyone can almost just rationally develop within themselves, and that there's going to be this kind of, everyone's going to hook themselves into this cloud of a kind of a shared rationality and labeling system. Somehow, magically, everyone is just going to have the same terms rattling around in their brain, and they're going to have the same general roadmap that they're all going to independently agree through. That's somehow going to be the latent atmosphere within a decentralized society. I believe in decentralization. I think that it has to be structured, though, and almost when he gives his four-stage solution, that what he is completely overlooking when he talks about coherence is he is not talking about groups, and he's not talking about institutions. He's only talking about essentially your immediate significant other, and coupling essentially is all he is talking about. And it just seems so intellectually bankrupt, that the idea that everyone will just find their true partner and be content within themselves, and that will pervasively generate a better society. For the people who manage that, I'm sure it will be fine. But I'm sorry, it's not serious. That is not the transition between dominance to prestige. Let's say the burden of having some kind of shared belief, or some kind of compatible belief system between individuals. That's part of coherence. That's very important. The idea that, yes, people are not in a position where they are healthy enough to even start to engage in that level of coordination is problematic. But the idea that somehow they're just going to be able to extract that for themselves and create these very solid pair bonding units that will be so... is he talking about some kind of transitionary, this is the precondition for having something decent, as it were? Okay, that's a bit scattered and loose, I guess. But the biggest problem is that he sees individuals, and then he has a sociological paradigm, but he doesn't actually have any interface on it, or he doesn't have a realistic interface with that sociological perspective and treatment. His solution effectively is that everyone will magically have the same model and understanding of the sociological dimension. So, and he wants to, somehow everyone is just going to come to that through rationality. You know, it's almost like, I mean, it's the same as anything else that, well, if everyone just believed in the same religion, there'd be peace on earth kind of thing, you know. And yes, that might be probably true. If everyone just believed in one religion, that would be the route to fixing everything. That's perhaps not even necessarily so, depending on if the religion actually has any kind of, let's say, very explicitly laid down conflict resolution within itself. So we need religion with a conflict resolution within itself, that hopefully is a reasonable and rational one, and hopefully is one that doesn't have some kind of self-limiting degeneration, or, you know, some kind of shortcut that's a bit too superficial, that it doesn't actually treat matters delicately and with nuance and with a way to adapt and develop itself, or you know, and so yeah, and that relates to the thing of learning how to learn and such. But, you know, all of those things, I mean, they've essentially there are no old world religions that deal with that. The only, I guess, religion that talks about that directly would be Scientology, which is something that I recommend people have a look at. But Jordan Hall is not pushing for that level of gaining ground, which, you know, I mean, it's incredibly disembodied. The intellectualism is disembodied. You know, it just is obsessed with the sociological paradigm effectively, and people cannot just kind of identify themselves with the sociological paradigm. They do so as identifying as being part of a group. And therefore, it's very important to have groups that are constituted, let's just say, in values and organizational structure, which doesn't entrench dominance, right? That would be the goal. And that does require some clear thinking. It does require some clear reasoning, and it does require underlining, malignant elements and propositions and postulates which are kind of locked into some kind of internal antagonism and self-defeatism, or, you know, or at least some kind of self-limiting factor that depresses the expression of self-determinism or sovereignty. This is something that undermines sovereignty. So, you know, cataloging the things which undermine sovereignty and such. Now, still, you have to institutionalize these things. And, you know, that can be done, I would say, only when you are in an independent bubble, and I mean that almost in a legal sense. And I mean, there are ways to follow the law to create a stable enough independent bubble where you understand everything that's happening within that bubble, and it functions. You know, so those are two important, I would say, requirements for game B. Is that there has to be some level of transparency, but then there has to be enough pragmatic coordination living in that system that is transparent, that can actually conserve itself and you know, preserve its own standards, and hopefully be able to use some jargon from game A, concentrate capital investment in productivity in order to generate a higher standard of living. In a sense, that is what has generated wealth in capitalism, is that, and in fact, that is what capitalism is less and less capable of doing as we move on, is that it's less able to concentrate capital investment into the facility of production, because they do so at the risk of displacing their own consumers effectively by firing workers. Most of the economy already does not innovate. It self-limits itself. It's choosing not to innovate in order to preserve and extend the life and viability of capitalism. And so, in some sense, it stops being fully capitalistic, and the only way to preserve the wealth production that happened in capitalism is to do it in-house, effectively. And you effectively then have to transfer. You have to change, or at least within groups that form. And I wouldn't do this with the state. I wouldn't do this anything to do with government. But basically, you have private-scale, independent collectives that organize themselves to invest in generating their own amenities and their own, and then they can do so in a way that minimizes waste, and that has they would be able to do things that the private industry is not capable of doing because of monopoly restrictions. So effectively, what you could do is you could generate products basically in order to tailor them towards creating the best kind of waste in that production. I don't know what they call it, but basically usually every productive process has some kind of what do they call it? Side. It has an externality of that. There is something that is produced in the production, in the making of something, which is left over, and that which is useless, whatever. And so instead of designing the cheapest product, you design the product around creating the most ideal form of waste, which is useful to some other industry. And so you have a kind of recycling between industries where the waste from one production facility is the fuel or the and so you have to try and balance that out. And so at some point you have to use lines of production that create a kind of interchangeable waste that can be used in a multi-purpose ways. And so you actually end up perhaps even creating products that are not using the best materials, but they are using, in a sense, the most sustainable materials. Even though the process might be more expensive, there is no external residue that the whole thing can be made to balance, as it were. And you can invest in that, and you can intensify capital investment to the point at which it doesn't even require any kind of labor input. Might require some, but eventually you would be able to obviate all of that. But the problem is that you also need people with, let's say, a political consciousness, a social consciousness that can be operated from the individual level, that can actually handle living in such a society, which we don't have. We do not have the technology of culture in the general public. They would not be able to survive living in such a society. That perhaps would generate an extreme form of status seeking, an extreme, a weird sort of unbridled prestige. Where very strange things would happen, that it's I would almost say, as a humanist, this is not meant to be followed prescriptively, but this is as an imaginary exercise to understand the depth of the problem, is that you almost don't want to solve the scarcity problem too quickly, because then you get over the challenge of culture in the wrong way. You solve the problem in the wrong way, and then you end up essentially giving the keys to the kingdom to people who can't function within that space. They cannot conserve it, and because they don't understand it effectively, and they will find a way essentially to generate the havoc and, let's say, the to invent the havoc which is needed to almost re-stimulate their reactive circuitry of just to preserve their own style of personality, just to reinvigorate enough resistance that lets them apply their there's no easy way to summarize this, but basically people on a very fundamental level, on the psychological level, the so-called normal adult is insane, is pathological, and we don't see a lot of. I mean, we do actually see a lot of this if you look, if you know how to look, let's just say. But if you put people in a scenario where they are given the keys to the kingdom, as it were, they will have to contrive ways of unleashing and giving themselves excuses to act on this machinery. They won't be. They won't find convenient. I mean, the kind of crazy stuff that I imagine happening would be, like those people that created dungeons in their basements, and such. A better example of this in science fiction would be if you watch the Lex, the 90s science fiction. And the original universe which they come from in the Lex, which they call the Light Zone, which is governed by a fascistic order, and then they escape to the dark universe, which anyway. What is the... Okay, let me just collect myself back on the subject. So, but basically, a good way of let's say, from anthropology, I can describe the issue slightly from there, is that we need a nomadic time in our history in order to develop and inculcate a civilized disposition. And if we just sort of switch off the scarcity tap, there isn't enough pressure in order to... Jordan Hall, I would say, is an example of this. Is that he's so pie in the sky, looking at this abstractly. He is in fact, somehow he believes that the structures are so rational and clear, and that they will always be there, civilizing and intrinsically allowing for coordination between honest people. So much so that he has no care in preserving institutional structures, or at least he didn't even mention that as one of his 4 stages or steps. I mean, if anything, okay, so let me just recap that my general suggestion to him is to dislocate himself from this analogy of almost like an evolutionary problem that he contemplates on the level of society or the collective, or so he's got these sociological problems that he as an individual wants to solve as an individual, and he's not using the proper implement. He doesn't advocate for an implement. He just kind of vaguely says what needs to happen and something will fit the bill. That is... if anything, that is what we are suffering from collectively as well. And this relates to something like the Führer principle, the guardianship principle. And essentially, we do need something that will stop that from taking control and taking cultural hegemony. Be that in the form of some kind of constitution, which again Jordan Hall does not speak about, and because he obviously has no way of dealing with that almost inherent problem of how would you enshrine an a constitution? What would the detail of that constitution be? And so because he can't say this is the constitution that we should move forward with on an individual level, because he somehow, it's so pure that we can all just kind of grope towards it blindly, individually, and because everyone commits to that program, that new program, eventually it will create a kind of momentum that will break us free of game A. It's to call it pie in the sky is even the idea that you're going to rehabilitate yourself with your true love, and then somewhat loosely insinuating that there will be a decentralized system in which then that's where you will get your sufficiency from. It's something that popped into my mind listening to this, which is just that, what about a monetary system? So how will the decentralized economy work or society work? What happens when someone tries to create a viral monetary system that operates through some kind of fiat? What about challenges to decentralization or compromises to decentralization which seek to maximize some kind of effective coordination? And, oh, yeah, I actually thought of the actual point now, is that the problem is not the pure reasoning. The problem is actually in the arbitrary issues that are left over, which will always be left over. There will always be some level of arbitrary choice which has to be made. And they're effectively, okay, so this is something that Jordan Hall, he hasn't made his position contrary to the point that I'm using to contradict him, but I think that this is implicit in a lot of his thinking. The idea is that individually we can all just work rationally, reasonably, and for some kind of positive progressive purpose, and structurally we can have something like a blank slate that is kept blank for individuals to kind of coordinate as they might and as they may, and that will be enough to like have this kind of perfect decentralized honesty and peace. And that, I think, that's quite a far shot in itself. And then it becomes impossible with the factor that I'm about to talk about. The problem is not, let's say, if everyone is reasoning properly, if everyone just wants to be reasoning properly and wants to learn how to learn. That isn't even the problem. The problem is that itself is also a problem. People not wanting to learn how to learn and not having that kind of, let's call it a positive purpose, a good purpose, or a good momentum that is capable of existing in a justifiable way that's coherent. That's justified through its coherence or internal consistency or whatever. That itself is a challenge, but what is a greater challenge is that even when everyone is coherent, there are still matters which essentially do not have one answer. They have multiple answers, and therefore there are options. And there is no way of limiting those options, and just the mere fact that there are such a wide variety and spectrum of problems means that there has to be some level of communication and coordination. Now, even how you would construe a negotiating table for those matters to be dealt with, even before you get to the negotiating table, you will have to construct it out of some arbitrary happenstance. There will have to be some kind of history attached to it. There will have to be some kind of story attached to it. There will have to be some kind of note of invitation to that table. How will that be comprised of? You cannot do that in a sociologically answerable way. That is clearly justified in terms of challenging the sociological issue, because there are many options in how you would overcome that sociological quandary, because the sociological issue or problem is somewhat disembodied. And so there are multiple conflicting answers that they don't conflict with the sociological problem. They all answer the sociological problem, but those multiple answers conflict with each other. They're mutually exclusive. And how will you navigate that? You cannot do that in a purely decentralized system. You have to do that in a system in which people collectively make an arbitrary edifice or inclination towards something or another. And maybe eventually, depending on the evolution of the system, that is something that has to be revised. And then you've got the same kind of political self-entrapment, which is not even necessarily a problem so much as you have enough good faith to collectively shovel yourself out of the hole that has just kind of appeared, that there is no stable, decentralized, one-size-fits-all. It will always require people with good insight and clear thinking. The biggest problem that we have in our current society is not even it's not the quality of of the people in politics. It's really the quality of the people in journalism is what we are suffering from. We're suffering from a drought of honest critique, and a drought in terms of the mainstream, at least. There's no sense-making apparatus. There's definitely something. So, as hopefully YouTube eventually completely takes over the media, or something like YouTube, or people having perhaps, they sometimes have some roundtables on news programs. When that is done more by, let's say, intellectuals on Twitch or something like that, where it's done in real time, where it's it's live, where it's not just this kind of recordings of monologues and such, when it's something that's more engaged and fluid, and when you then have a greater sense of testing the character of the people who are curating the knowledge that they are dispensing, or at least the insights that they are proposing and suggesting. So, hopefully we're going to move into a culture that has those higher standards, and that is able to kind of preserve those higher standards, and not fall back on itself, and not be kind of swallowed up and chewed up by the mob justice and whatever fascistic creature that labels itself and labels its new dogma and orthodoxy of groupthink and slave morality, and there are certainly demons and monsters in this that I would even say they hopefully are historically useful right now, because they are what we need to immunize ourselves from intellectually. We need to create a culture that is resilient to these forces, to these sorts of specious psychological mind viruses, and that comes from an appreciation of psychological politics, as a term that perhaps I should try to develop into a more cogent or usable. Trying to coin a phrase, but not explaining very deeply, although I've tried to exemplify some of that kind of analysis through my different recordings. But although Jordan Hall picks apart the problems, he does so from an ill-fitting conceptual framework. It's not properly seated in, to call it, the pragmatism of William James or something like that. It's not properly situated philosophically. And that doesn't mean that it's not without its utility, but it still has to be worked on to make it actionable, or at least translated into something that is worth turning into a project. And I think that is why the solutions that he has distilled, that Jordan Hall has distilled, ring hollow and a bit too abstract. In that his general thinking is not able to cope with the arbitrary factors in reality and the arbitrary nature of part of the problem. That there is a part of the problem that has to be solved, and the part that I'm focusing on now that he does not address at all are the arbitrary facets that have to be overcome. They cannot just be over, and that's, let's just say, people will have valid and conflicting ways of dealing with those things. And so that is a conflict resolution that has to be broached, and it is best approached. Approached and navigated by some kind of institutional function. And obviously, you want institutions that are capable of revising themselves. I mean, you see, this level of thinking is people are deeply impoverished intellectually from thinking on this level, because they have been subject to substandard legal systems. That the most legal systems in the world have been corrupted by Napoleonic thought, by the Napoleonic law codes, which are kind of an instantiated democratic dicta that, were perhaps an advancement in some kind in making some kind of greater political effectiveness. I mean, essentially, it is what made Germany so strong. Let's say the visionary foresight of structuring and setting up a kind of political identity through the imposition of structure. It can have very immediate, depending on how well it's planned, it can look very comprehensive, and it can empower people essentially to feel like they're part of something that is bringing order to the world. But historically, that will generate some kind of residue, and it wears thin. And then you've got a kind of, the only way to prop it up is you basically become a slave to this kind of mythology or dogma that it is kind of inbuilt into it. And it is itself a kind of subtle slave morality in some level. But what starts off as the legal culture eventually seeps into the culture of society. It generates the morality. And even the American legal system works like this. It's democratic dicta. It's that you follow the law because you paid your vote, and now you bought the law yourself because of your interface with the state. That you paid your vote, and now what you buy with your vote is that you are governed by the state. So you pay your vote, and you buy the governance that you get. It's a disgusting kind of proprietorship, which undermines the integrity of justice and of the individual even. That the only way to have an effective republic is to have something which the only modern form is the Roman Dutch system. The substantive law, which was in the only place it was inherited was the Dutch, which was eventually taken over by Napoleon. So it doesn't even exist in Europe. It only exists in South Africa. And is what, the legal culture in South Africa is so sophisticated. When you go to the international law courts, when they are arbitrating between the different legal systems and things like that, the cream of the crop, the people who have the best legal minds, are the people who understand the Roman Dutch law. They're the ones who understand the different legal systems and the limitations of those legal systems, and just how thin most of them are, just how really inferior they all are to the Roman Dutch legal system. And you have to go to Qatar and see the international zones and such, and the arbitration systems and the level of legal debate, and they can very clearly demarcate the failings, and also they can even predict the future, as it were. They can predict the developments that will have to happen in a legal system because of how it's been structured. And it's like a program that runs its course, and the only one that is not programmed is the Roman Dutch substantive law. Is the only one fit. It has general principles. It actually derives everything from principle. It accomplishes that. You can actually have a independent judiciary. You can only have, in effect, an independent judiciary with something like, so I mean, having a public thing, which is what the term republic is. It res publica, the public thing. The only way to do that is with having a real interface between the individual and the principles that govern him or her. And there are lots of things that are done within the Roman. It's amazing the complexity that it can support. The private judgment system, the private. You can get a private sentence. There's a huge complexity of and sophistication. Anyway, I'm not going to be able to fully go into enough examples to make that. Yeah, I guess I'm going to stop this recording.